At the end of chapter 6, we saw that Jesus had crossed over after walking on the water to the region of Bethsaida and Gennesaret on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. And then in the first part of chapter 7, we saw how the scribes and Pharisees came to him from Jerusalem to question him. Now, beginning in chapter 7, verse 24, we see that Jesus is going out of his way to leave that area. So verses 24 through 30 say this: "And from there he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And he entered a house and did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. But immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him, and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, 'Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs.' But she answered him, 'Yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs.' And he said to her, 'For this statement you may go on your way. The demon has left your daughter.' And she went home and found the child lying in a bed, and the demon gone." Now, this event, plus the next two events, a healing of a blind man, and also the feeding of the 4,000 at the beginning of chapter 8, dramatize the point that Jesus made earlier in chapter 7, verses 14 through 23, namely that just as there are no unclean foods, so are there no unclean people. In other words, he's talking about the Gentiles. Or to put it another way, all people are equally unclean. The Jew is no closer to God than are Gentiles, since all people, Jew and Gentile alike, have equally been made in the image of God, and all people are equally lost in sin. God, as you may recall, brought that point home to Peter in Acts chapter 10 with the vision of the animals in the sheep. So let's take a look at Jesus' healing of the Syrophoenician woman's daughter. Tyre and Sidon were two cities on the Mediterranean seacoast and were part of ancient Phoenicia. This was a Gentile area. And the woman here is specifically identified, and it's the only person specifically identified in Mark as a Gentile, a Syrophoenician woman. We can infer here that Jesus entered the house and he didn't want anybody to know. Now, what's going on here with Jesus' interaction with the Syrophoenician woman? Theologically, one of the things that may be going on, Jesus' statement in verse 27, "Let the children be fed first, for it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs," reflects what is said in Matthew's account of this same event, where Jesus said, "I was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Now, this reflects God's plan of salvation to the Jew first and also to the Greek, as found in Romans 1, verse 16, in Acts, and elsewhere. And the reason is that only the Jews could understand the significance of Jesus. No Roman or Indian or Japanese would have understand this, because he was embedded in the Old Testament. As Paul said in Romans 9, it's to the Israelites to whom belong the adoption as sons, the glory of the covenants, the giving of the law, the temple service, and the promises, whose are their fathers, and from whom is Christ according to the flesh. The Gentiles at that time, before the coming of Christ, according to Ephesians 2, were excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, strangers to the covenants, and had no hope and were without God in the world. So God came in the person of Jesus, a Jew, in the fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures. But God had promised to bless the entire world through Israel, according to the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12 and Genesis 22. So, given this background, instead of seeing Jesus' mindset in terms of either or, one should see his mission to Israel on behalf of the nations. In other words, his focus on Israel, Jesus was doing the work necessary for the entire world to be blessed. And so, in other words, it's a mission to Israel for the world. And that's why later on in John chapter 4, in Jesus' meeting with the Samaritan woman at the well, he said, salvation is from the Jews. He didn't say salvation is for the Jews. And later on, of course, in the Great Commission, Jesus sent his disciples and us to the entire world. Now, even though that is God's order of salvation, and you can see the historical reason for that, Robert Gundry suggests that Jesus' statement about the children being fed first as opposed to the little dogs relates primarily not to the order of salvation to the Jews first and then to the Gentiles, but to Jesus' wanting to teach his disciples in private, which is why he went away to Tyre and Sidon and entered a house and didn't want anybody to know. Gundry points out that the only other place in Mark where Jesus said he did not want to be known was in Mark 9, verses 30 and 31, because he was teaching his disciples about his coming death and resurrection. And so the parallelism between the phraseology here in chapter 7, verse 24, and in Mark 9, verse 30, suggests that Jesus wanted privacy to teach his disciples. And so that taking bread from the little children and throwing it to the little dogs would deprive his disciples of the attention that he needed to train them up well. And so the other thing, though, that we should note about this is that Jesus nevertheless did engage this woman. Although his statement, let the children be fed first, for it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs, might sound harsh or insulting, it was not. And the woman didn't take it that way. Now, the typical Greek word for dog did have generally a negative connotation, but Jesus did not use that word. Rather, he used the word little dogs, talking about household pets. And there's no parallel for the term he used in a bad or negative sense. Indeed, the little dogs were admitted to the house. They could be found under the table at mealtime. And so Jesus was painting a picture, a household picture of pets loved by the children. And so the woman, as we will see, obviously took it this way. She was not insulted. But I think there may be a deeper practical reason why Jesus made the statement he did. And that was to reveal her faith and confirm the Gentiles are on the same level as Jews. Now, the Syrophoenician woman demonstrated her faith by coming to Jesus, falling down at her feet, and begging him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Matthew's account of this event gives some further details, because in Matthew's account, she began by addressing Jesus as Son of David, Matthew 15, verse 22. Now, that, of course, was a Jewish term for the Jewish Messiah. In other words, she, a Gentile, was coming to Jesus on Jewish terms. And in Matthew's account, that seems to be what prompted Jesus' statement to say, I was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But then, in Matthew's account, the woman renewed her appeal, not on Jewish grounds, but on the universal ground of human need, by saying, her next statement in Matthew's account is, Lord, help me. And that's when Jesus made the statement about let the children be fed first. It's not right to take their bread and throw it to the dogs. So he's alluding to this scene that's taking place right there. He wants to be teaching his disciples. He's in this house. This woman comes, and we need to understand, in Mark, all of Jesus's healings and exorcisms had been done in person, not remotely, which means if he followed that pattern, he would have had to have left the house and gone to where the daughter was to cast out the demon. But what the woman does, she seems to understand what was going on, because she did not hesitate, and she took that imagery and said, Yes, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. In other words, instead of having to go, she's just asking for a crumb from the table. And those crumbs, in fact, and sometimes the children would purposely give them to the dogs, they're intended for the dogs. So Jesus' comparison of the children and the dogs is not rejected by her, but is taken one step further by her. In other words, if the dogs eat the crumbs under the table, they are fed at the same time as the children, and they don't have to wait. And there doesn't have to be an interruption of the meal. In other words, Jesus, you can continue to teach your disciples. I just want the little crumb of healing of my daughter. And so Jesus commends both her faith in Matthew and her answer here in Mark. And now for the first time, Jesus exorcises a demon remotely. In short, the interaction here shows Jesus to be not only the Jewish Messiah, but the Savior of the entire world. And the Gentiles don't have to wait until after the Jews get their portion, but can begin by receiving their portion now. So, although Jesus may have gone to Tyre and Sidon for reasons of privacy, not mission, he did deliberately go into Gentile territory and interacted with the first clearly described person whom Mark clearly describes as a Gentile. He did exorcise the demon from the daughter. And so, again, he is illustrating here just what he taught, that defilement is from within, not without. And just as that all kinds of food are equally clean, so are all kinds of people. And we're going to see this in the next two events that he takes place. Now, the next event is found in verses 31 through 37. It says, he then returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, in the region of the Decapolis. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. And he looked up to heaven, and he sighed, and said to him, Ephatha, that is, be opened. And the ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged them to tell no one. But the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, he has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Now, Decapolis was a league of Greco-Roman cities that was founded after the death of Alexander the Great, with the exception of Damascus in Syria, which of course had been founded beforehand. Now, under Roman rule, the cities of Decapolis were not included in the territory of the Herodian kingdom. In other words, Herod Antipas, he was the tetrarch over Galilee, but that did not include the Decapolis. And they were not included in the Roman province of Judea. In fact, they were allowed considerable political autonomy, and they were under Roman protection. And basically, each of these 10 cities functioned sort of as a city-state with jurisdiction over the surrounding area. Now, all but one were east of the Jordan River. Most of their population was Gentiles, and those cities invariably sided with the colonial Roman power over the indigenous Jewish population. Now, in returning from Tyre and Sidon, again we see Jesus going out of his way to visit Decapolis, because they were on the other side, the east side of the Jordan River. So, by doing this, he's reaching out to Gentiles and laying a foundation for the mission to the Gentiles, which would begin in earnest after his resurrection. Now, in verse 32, it says that in addition to being deaf, the man had a speech impediment. Later, in verse 37, he's called mute. The only other place in the Bible where the Greek word translated speech impediment is used is in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which was completed more than 100 years before Jesus, and which was commonly used by the disciples and Jesus and by others at that time. And it's a translation of Isaiah 35, verse 6, which says, "Then shall the lame man leap as a hart, and the tongue of the stammerers shall speak plainly." Now, this is, again, theologically significant. We've seen in multiple places how things that are said in the Old Testament books, whether it's Leviticus or Deuteronomy or Jonah or Isaiah or others, find their fulfillment and point forward to Jesus. We see the same thing here because in Isaiah 35, it's talking about the events that mark Israel's return from exile, the return of God, Yahweh, to Zion, and a restoration of creation. And in Isaiah 35, verses 1 through 10, it focuses on healing. And because then it says, "Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, the ears of the deaf will be unstopped, the lame will leap like a deer, the tongue of the mute will shout for joy." So Jesus intended his mighty works, his healings, his miracles, to symbolically fulfill what had been prophesied in the book of Isaiah. And we know that because when John the Baptist sent his emissaries to Jesus to say, "Are you the one we're looking for, or should we look for somebody else?" Jesus quoted from Isaiah 35 to go back and tell John what you see. And then he quotes from Isaiah 35. Now, Mark is again quoting from this and using this healing, I think, for at least two reasons. Number one, to dramatize that Jews and Gentiles are equal in God's sight. And secondly, to identify Jesus as the Messiah, who is fulfilling the prophecies of Isaiah, but now in Gentile territory as well as in Israel. It's interesting that the people in verse 37 said, "He has done," referring to Jesus, "done all things well." That is in contrast with Jesus' assessment of the hypocrisy of the Pharisees in chapter 7, verse 6, where he said, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites." So these subtle connections and the wording is drawing out important theological points. Now, there's an important aspect of this healing that's worthy of our attention. And again, we're going to see in a minute how, if you look beneath the surface, it's making a theological point. Verse 33 says that Jesus took the man aside from the crowd privately. Now, this may have been to fix his attention on this man, but may also have been so that this man could fix his individual attention on Jesus. We need to remember Jesus' concentration on the individual, not the masses, in our relationships, both individually with people and as churches. This is particularly important in our evangelism and discipleship. Jesus was always concerned about the individual. Yes, he spoke to the masses sometimes, but I mean, he primarily is interested in individuals. Further, this is the all right. Let's go on to the next event, because this is the third event, the healing or the exorcism of the Syrophoenician woman's daughter, the healing of the deaf and mute man, both a Gentile, explicitly a Gentile, the Syrophoenician woman. Now he goes out of his way into Gentile territory. These are individuals, but the third event in this series, and I think this is intentional, Jesus is going out of his way to, you might say, begin his mission to the Gentiles. And it's very important. This is the feeding of the 4,000 in chapter 8, verses 1 through 10, which says this: "In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered, and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from far away. And he asked them, How many loaves do you have? They said, 7. He directed the crowd to sit down on the ground. He took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish. And having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away. And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. Now, this feeding of the 4,000 is the counterpart to the feeding of the 5,000 in Mark chapter 6. Now, there is no indication after Jesus healed the deaf mute man that he left Decapolis. And consequently, we can infer that he was still primarily in Gentile territory. And there's another reason or so that we can infer this. It says, since Decapolis is on the east side of Galilee, and we see that in Matthew's account of this event, that Matthew says, in Matthew 15, 29 through 31, it says that the crowd here glorified the God of Israel. Now, the language indicates that those glorifying the God were not Jews, but were Gentiles, because otherwise they'd have said, they'd glorify the God of Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. I mean, they're glorifying the God of Israel here, in other words, kind of a foreign God, in other words, indicating that they are Gentiles. Additionally, after feeding the 4,000, Mark reports that Jesus and the disciples got in the boat and went to the district of Dalmanutha. And Matthew's account says that he went to the region of Magadan. Now, from these passages, it's reasonable to infer that Magadan and the region of Dalmanutha were contiguous, next to each other. And I think we can gather that they were on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, because in Mark 8, verse 13, it says that immediately after this event, that the Pharisees had argued with him, and then he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. So that is indicating that Jesus was on the east side, the Gentile side of the Sea of Galilee, and then that Magadan and Dalmanutha were on the other side, the western Jewish side. And so in any event, there is something, so we see a parallel. After feeding the 5,000 Jews, he crossed into Gentile territory, Tyre and Sidon. Now he feeds 4,000 Gentiles and crosses back into Jewish territory. So I think, as I began this by saying, the Syrophoenician woman, the deaf and mute man, and the feeding of the 4,000, I think, are all dealing with Gentiles in Gentile territory for a reason, as we've seen. Just as there is no unclean food, there are no unclean people. And this is sort of a proleptic or foreshadow, or the beginning, you might say, of the mission to the Gentiles. And I think this is confirmed by subtle things beneath the surface of this feeding of the 4,000. And we see that because when he fed the 5,000, there were 12 basketfuls left over. These were Jews. So the 12 would naturally suggest the 12 tribes. But with the feeding of the 4,000 Gentiles, there were 7 baskets of leftovers. Why? I think this goes back to Deuteronomy 7, verse 1, which says that there were 7 nations in the land, 7 nations of Gentiles, in the land when Israel entered the land that they had to conquer. And so by Jesus, of course, had previously told the Jews that he is the bread of life. Now, by feeding 4,000 Gentiles in Gentile territory, he is showing that he is the bread of life for all people everywhere. And there's also, again, subtlety in the wording. The baskets of the 5,000 was a particular Greek word called kophanos, which were Jewish traveling baskets. They carried their food in wicker baskets. But the baskets used in the 4,000 are a different word. They were called spurus. Now, the spurus was a larger thing. Sometimes it's translated as a hamper. And we know that the spurus was larger than a kophanos because in Acts 9, when Paul escaped from Damascus, the plot to kill him, his disciples took him and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. And the word for the basket that Paul was in was a spurus. So this indicates that Jesus' mission to the Gentiles may have begun small, Syrophoenician woman's daughter, but who only received crumbs from the table, remember. But in the end, the Gentiles will be filled to overflowing. And given the difference between the size of the baskets in the 5,000 and the 4,000, in the end, the harvest of Gentiles is going to be larger than that of the Jews. And that, of course, has obviously proven true in history. And finally, the early church regarded the number 7 as indicating fullness and completeness. And so in the book of Revelation is written to the 7 churches that are in Asia. Now, there were more than 7 churches, but the number 7 is indicating that it's to all the churches. And as we talk about in our book on Revelation and book on biblical eschatology, the book is written to all churches, Revelation is, to all churches everywhere. The number 7 signifying fullness and completeness. So when we have the feeding of the 4,000 here, typologically and symbolically, the 4,000 with 7 baskets of leftovers indicate that Christ's church will not be complete until the Gentiles have been fully grafted in, as Romans 11 says, to form one united body in which there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So I think we can see here that the feeding of the 4,000 is the third step of this mission to the Gentiles. It begins with a remote healing of the Syrophoenician woman's daughter in private. It then moves to an individual, a deaf and mute man, in public. But then it's not limited to just individuals. He then feeds 4,000 in public, and the symbolism of what he does and the 7 baskets left over indicate, again, that Jesus is the Savior of the entire world, and it doesn't matter what your background is, and therefore he redeems people out of every tribe, tongue, nation, and people in the entire world. So when we see the subtleties, the language that is being used, and so on, we see deep theological significance that lie hidden behind the scenes in the Gospel of Mark, which is one of the reasons why this Gospel is just so absolutely overwhelming. In the next lecture, we're going to complete the last 2 events of part 1 of the book of Mark, and the conclusion, basically, of Jesus's Galilean ministry and his ministry in the Decapolis.